Would you also like to perform juicy one-shots like the one you see before you? Then like and subscribe and keep watching to see. Renegade has been an underdog for quite some time in PvP, but recently the Shortbow has been buffed, and ArenaNet created a monster when they allowed 7shot to no longer be a ground target skill, which originally was very hard to land and still didn't even land sometimes, because if you're in the wrong positioning just slightly, it'll just mess up. Now 7shot is a targeted ability and very easy to land, and they didn't rebalance the skill to make up for that fact. So you can basically one-shot people with 7shot. And it's been used for a little bit in PvP and was recently nerfed, and then they didn't nerf it in World versus World. So here we are with a one-shot Renegade build. I've actually modified it to be a little bit less of a one-shot build because I feel like you get too hard punished if you don't land the one shot. And obviously there's outnumbered situations where you're just going to die instantly. So this is a little bit more sustain than a full one-shot version with like Scholar Runes, which actually does insane damage. But you can still do decent amount of damage with 7shot, and you can land more of them because you have the sustain to do so. So it's a lot less counterplayable, but it still has some decent damage. So this is the build. I take Invocation and Retribution because those are pretty much mandatory on any kind of Renegade build, because Retribution has too much synergy with Renegade and Invocation has too much synergy with Revenant. So you just take that on every Rev build. But yeah. The traits are Invoker's Rage, which gives you Fury. So every time you swap Legend, you'll get Fury. You rely on your Fury to get your damage because this is a power build. And then you have Cleansing Channel. This gives you Condi Cleanse on Legend swap. You can I'm showing you guys my version of the build, but I'm going to also comment on like the one-shot version, which would use Rising Tide, which is like a Scholar effect of giving you 7% more damage when you're above 90%. And then you have 7% more damage while you have Fury, which is good, because you're going to have pretty much permanent Fury. And then you have Rapid Flow, which gives you Swiftness and a little bit of healing every 5 seconds. This is just nice because this is where you get the Swiftness on the build. And then you also gain Fury when you disable a foe, so that's really important because your first engagement into a fight is usually an attempt to one-shot someone with like a CC and then your 7shot. So you're not going to be swapping Legends immediately, but you could. But yeah, this just makes it a lot more convenient because your immediate disable is going to give you that Fury for the crit damage and just general precision. And then you have Charged Mists. So Charged Mist gives you 25 extra energy whenever you swap Legends when you are below 10 energy before you swap. So that's kind of difficult to do all the time unless you're being very liberal with your upkeep skills. So Impossible Odds is very easy to spam out right before you're about to swap. So you're saying, okay, I'm about to swap, let me just stay in Impossible Odds, and then I swap, and then you're at 75 energy. Do the same thing with the Hammers spell in Chalice, and you can basically pretty much always get 75 because these skills don't really have an animation to them, so you can use them even while you're CC'd. And you just think, well, I'm about to swap soon, so I just have that upkeep going, and then I spam all my energy and then swap. And that allows you the ability to land bigger combos because you have more energy resource at one time. So you can do big plays with your Scorch Razor into Spirit Crush into 7shot with a Heroic Command. Also, just in general, you have more versatility in what you can actually do because you have more energy. And Also, riposting shadows is a very expensive skill. So when you get 75 energy, you can kind of like do 2 riposting shadows in a row, which gives you a lot of sustain potential and evasion. So it's really nice. Then in Retribution, you have increased endurance regeneration, which is nice because you'll see later why you need a lot of endurance. And then you have Dome of the Mist. Whenever you cast your heal skill, you will weaken foes inside the dome and block projectiles. It's kind of a hard to see animation there, but it's a very strong skill because it allows you to weaken people who are attacking you in melee, and then people who are attacking you from range are also getting blocked from their projectiles. So it's just in general, whenever you have the skill up, it's pretty much giving you value. And then you also gain Vigor when you evade. Vigor is kind of like more into the enduring recovery thing where you gain more endurance. And Dome of the Mists also scales very well with Dwarven Battle Training, which is whenever you CC someone, you will weaken them, and then you deal 10% more damage to weakened foes. So if you start off your burst with like a Scorch Razor, and then you go into your 7-shot, you get the weakness on them, and you get the Fury on yourself. So it kind of sets up all your damage very simply, right? You just press 2 buttons, and you've got all your modifiers pretty much, and you just do the damage. You also take reduced damage while you have Vigor, so evading attack afterwards you'll take less damage, and 15% damage reduction is really good. Then you have Steadfast Rejuvenation, which gives you healing for each point of upkeep. So you have 8 stacks of upkeep on Impossible Odds, so that's 8 times 40, so that heals you for what, like 300 maybe, or 240, I think I remember. And then in Jalis, you have the upkeep skill of Vengeful Hammers, which would give, yeah, this is like 240, and I think the other one is 300. So, you can upkeep these skills pretty often because of Charge Miss, and this gives you quite a bit of sustain as a result, so I like that. And for the one-shot build, you could go for Vicious Reprisal, which gives you 10% more damage while you have Retail, and you'd get Retail from using your heal skill in Jalis or from Wrought Iron Will, but I feel like this wouldn't work as well because you have to dodge to get Retail or use your heal skill to get Retail. So this is kind of why I don't like the one-shot build. It's kind of awkward sometimes. And then you'd also want to be using Ashen Demeanor anyways for the one-shot build. Speaking of which, Ashen Demeanor will give you 5 Vuln and Cripple when you disable a target. So that kind of works with the Scorch Razor kind of burst thing that you do there. But I feel that the 5 Vuln and Cripple isn't really that necessary. So I just go for Wrought Iron Will, which gives you regen for like 300 healing every 3 seconds that you evade something. And that's kind of nice for being outnumbered and just giving you sustain. So I like it. And then in Renegade, you also have Callous Fervor. So Callous Fervor, whenever you flank or critically strike a foe, you will gain 1 stack of Callous Fervor, and that lasts for 12 seconds because I have Lasting Legacy, and it also has a higher effect because of Lasting Legacy. So Lasting Legacy basically makes the Callous Fervor last longer and be more potent, right? And what it does is it makes every stack give 50 ferocity and 3% condition damage. Obviously, this build doesn't really use condition damage, but the 50 ferocity is really strong because you can basically upkeep 5 stacks of Callous Fervor non-stop, which gives you 250 ferocity, which, yeah, that's a lot of damage. And because Lasting Legacy also increases the duration of your Callous Fervor, you can kind of do this thing where, so you stack up your Callous Fervor and you get to 5 stacks, and then it's going to run off in like 12 seconds, right? But you can recharge it with your Heroic Command, and because Heroic Command has a 10-second cooldown, and the Callous Fervor lasts 12 seconds, you can basically upkeep your Callous Fervor in between fights. And in that way, you can sort of like front load your burst because you have the Callous Fervor from the last fight because you keep spamming your F2 skill. And you can also gain 15 might because of Lasting Legacy. So this kind of allows you to get that one-shot potential that I was talking about. So right here, I'll just get the might, do the stun into the Scorch Razor or the 7-shot, and that did like 6k damage there. And, you know, this is a decently survivable build. So, yeah, that's pretty good. Then you also will have gaining Fury whenever you're below 50% HP and you're hit, which isn't too important. You pretty much have permanent Fury. But that's important for this trait, Brutal Momentum, which is going to give you Vigor whenever you gain Fury on an 8-second cooldown, but it lasts for 7 seconds. So it's pretty much permanent Vigor because you have Vigor from Retribution and you have Vigor from pretty much like 90% uptime here because you're always gaining Fury. So yeah, you've got almost permanent Vigor, which gives you tons of dodges. And also, whenever you are at full endurance, you will gain 33% crit chance. And we rely on this to basically make our equipment maximize or optimize the power and ferocity that I can give to get the most burst that we can. So that's a really important trait, and we'll talk about that more in the equipment section. And then you have Heart Piercer, which is really good because it allows your Shortbow skills to pierce. So your auto attack will hit multiple targets basically. It already kind of explodes when it hits the final location. So it is kind of weird, like in a way it can be a nerf to the auto attack because what it does is it shoots and then it explodes at that location where it ends. And because you pierce the target, it doesn't explode until it reaches there. So it doesn't actually explode on the target, which is kind of like a nerf in a way. But it's really important for Bloodbane Path and 7-shot, which are actually really strong skills, and you want to be hitting multiple people with that. My equipment is full Berserkers and 2 Valkyrie rings. So with that amount of precision, I basically get to 100% crit chance with Fury. So when I have Fury, I have 95% crit chance. You can go for 100%, but there's really no reason to go for 100% because sometimes you get keep buff and stuff like that. However, you do lose a lot of crit chance when you dodge, right? So you lose 33% crit chance because of Brutal Momentum. And you are going to obviously have to dodge a lot in this build, but how I think of it is you don't want to optimize for the ideal situation, right? Where you don't need to dodge at all. So you don't want to like get to like too low amount of crit chance, but you also don't want to get it too high because sometimes you will be in that ideal situation. So I get to like, you know, when I'm pretty much always going to have Fury. So I have like 62% crit chance when I don't have maximum endurance, but then I have, you know, like 95 when I do. So there is a huge discrepancy there, but it is very easy to get full endurance, right? Because you have so much vigor uptime in this build and you have enduring recovery. So yeah, you kind of, how I like to think of it is if you're going to die because you're not using your dodge, then the extra damage is really not worth it. So yeah, you want to dodge, right? You want to dodge, but it's just kind of like I think of it as like a convenience, right? To get that extra crit chance when you're at full endurance. But yeah, you don't want to be like dying to keep that crit chance, right? Your health is more important. But yeah, so the idea of the full Zerk is that I'm getting as much power and ferocity as possible. So I don't want to go any Marauders pieces because in that ideal situation where I do have 100% crit chance, that gives me the highest amount of burst that I can get. And I get that because Valkyrie and Berserker all have the highest amount of power and ferocity you can get. So I'm getting my precision from traits and fury, and I'm getting just as much damage as possible. And the food that I'm using is going to be power and ferocity as well. So yeah, you get a lot of burst damage from these stats. I am using Rune of Durability. Now, Scholar is going to give you way more damage, obviously. But as I said, durability is really nice for keeping you alive long enough to do that damage if you don't land it the first time. So the maximum health increase is kind of nice because you're not really using that much vitality since you're 2 pieces of Valkyrie. And you also get some boon duration, which is kind of nice because you do have a lot of might on this build, and you get some regen here and there. And just in general, durability is kind of like the rune that you use on builds that just go full Zerk, and that kind of rounds out the build. So durability is really nice for like full Zerk builds to give them a little bit of survivability to make them feel more viable and not so one trick. And I'm using like a Magi's staff, which just use like Valkyrie or I don't know, Berserker there as well. But don't worry about that. It doesn't really matter what stats you're on the staff. But I use cleansing and draining. So cleansing is really important because this build is lacking in Condi Cleanse. And if you're in the staff and you legend swap, then you will proc the cleansing swap if it's off cooldown, obviously. So you can kind of like, if you're in a kiting situation, just stay in staff and just swap between legends. And draining sigil is also really good because the staff 5 is a series of knockbacks, and draining sigil has no cooldown on it. So you can get multiple procs of draining, which is basically whenever you interrupt someone, you will steal life, which is like 1,000 damage and healing to you. And obviously if someone is already knocked back, you can't interrupt them again, right? You can multiple knock them, but you can't multiple interrupt them unless they like stun break and immediately attack. But hitting multiple foes and interrupting multiple foes will give you a lot of healing, and it kind of makes up for the lack of sustain this build has by allowing you to go into staff and use your staff 5 and then gain a lot of healing there. And on the Shortbow, I'm using obviously Berserker and Sigil of Impact, which gives you 3% damage and then 7% damage versus stunned or knocked down foes. So in this build, I have 1 knockdown, which is the Scorch Razor, which is kind of like the combo enabler of this build. So you're going to be dealing basically 10% more damage, which is going to give you a lot of damage during your combo, right? So you're going to do your Callous Fervor, and then your F2, and then you're going to knock the target down, and then you're going to use your 3 skill, and I did 7k there. So yeah, it's pretty good for like that burst combo. And then even if they're not knocked down, you will still have 3% more damage, which is nice, right? Because Force Sigil is 5%, so it's only 2% less than Force. You also gain more damage to stunned foes. So you have a stun on this build too, on Jade Winds, which is a 3-second stun. Also, on the Shortbow, I have Sigil of Generosity, which transfers a condition whenever you crit on a 6-second cooldown. So the build doesn't really have that much Condi Cleanse on it. So Generosity is kind of nice to allow you to sustain against those Condi builds. The food I would use is the cilantro lime sous vide steak, and that gives you more power and ferocity, which is going to give you more burst, and then it'll also give you 66% chance to steal life on critical hit. So it's just giving you the most amount of damage possible. If you don't want the ascended food, then go for the spicy butternut squash soup, and then just use tins of fruitcake, which will give you a good amount of power based on your precision and ferocity. So it's just really good for your damage modifiers. The skills are very simple. Your auto attack is just very reliable and quick. Does about 1,000 damage each when it crits. And your 2 skill is very strong because it does a sort of like portal at the target, and it shoots them not from your location but from their location. And that means like if there's a projectile block here, it'll go through it if it's not on the target, of course. And you can also use it while kiting very well because it does not respect the way you're facing. So it's really good at just adding in extra damage while you're kiting. And it will not work when you're line of sight. So you do need line of sight, but you don't need to be facing the target. So it's just really good. As you can see there, 2,700 damage. And then you have 7-shot, which is basically your bread and butter. You know, you use this skill, it does big damage. You do need to be facing the target when you first start using it, but once it's set off, you can turn away and kite it. You need to start casting the skill first though. So you land it and then you can turn around like that. So like by the time the first arrows are sent off, it's kind of already set in motion. And it'll also do a little bit of condi damage there, which is nice, but it is also a projectile finisher. So when you use it in Spirit Crush, it can give some burning, and even though this is a power build, it gets some decent burns. Spirit Crush is a ground target AoE that slows and burns and does a decent amount of damage, and you want to be able to use that while kiting as well. So you want to basically, you have to be facing the direction that you're casting it, so kind of like this. Like even though it says over here, it needs to be like kind of in front of me. And then while it's being casted, you can start kiting and moving in different directions. But you need to be careful that you don't interrupt it. So you need to do something like this, and then once it's started casting into the sky, then you can start kiting again. Then you have Scorch Razor, which is, you have to be facing the whole time basically. And yeah, it's just the knockdown. It's kind of like a wave, so it's not actually a projectile, so it's kind of nice. And that means that you need to be facing the target for your 1 and 5 skill. You need to start facing for your 3 and 4, and your 2 skill doesn't require any kind of like facing. So the Shortbow, it is a little bit clunky, but there is some kite potential on it, which you're going to have to get used to because you're going to be on the Shortbow most of the time. And then on Staff, you just have your auto attack. It actually does some decent damage, and it'll drop little bits of healing on the ground if you pick those up. And your 2 skill will do weakness, which is nice, but mainly I use it for the healing. If you don't hit anyone with it, it doesn't heal as much, but if you do hit someone, it'll do 50% more healing. And that's just kind of nice while kiting. If you've got excess energy, you can just use it to heal. And then you have your 3 skill, very strong block skill that will blind foes in front of you at the end of it. So what you want to do is you want to block, and then you want to face them right at the end of the block to also blind them. And then you have Renewing Wave. This is another heal skill. So you've got your 2 and your 4 you can use to heal yourself while you're kiting. And this is a blast finisher that also cleanses 2 conditions, so very important to utilize that for your Condi cleanse. And then your 5 skill is a very strong ability that will CC and evade in front of you. Has a little bit of a wind up, but yeah, it's just really good for proccing your Draining Sigil or just repositioning and evading. So Staff is like mainly a utility weapon. You use it to bridge the gap in between your bursts or whatever. Your stances are Shiro and Jealous. In Shiro, your heal skill is a buff that gives you basically enchanted daggers will attack your target if you hit them, and if you miss or whatever, then you'll lose charges of the daggers, but just hitting them will add extra damage to your target, which is a really aggressive heal skill, and it heals you for a decent amount as well. And then you have Reposing Shadows will give you Fury, which is really important for the build because that also gives you Vigor. And it'll remove all movement inhibiting conditions, evade, and break stun. And it'll also give you 15 endurance, which is also important because you want to be at max endurance right before you do your burst to get that extra crit chance. And then you have Phase Traversal, which is a port to the target, gives you a unblockable buff for 5 seconds on your next 2 attacks, and will give you quickness. This is a pretty bloated skill, and when you use it in conjunction with the burst combos that you'll see, you can do them very quickly. So usually though, you won't be able to use Phase Traversal in your burst unless you have like high energy already, because it's going to cost a lot of your energy. And then you have Impossible Odds, which is actually a really good skill with this build because it scales on your power damage and it can crit. And it's like a buff that increases your movement speed by 50%. And when you hit, it adds additional strikes to the target. And it has a 1/4 second delay. So basically you're hitting so often on this build that you get a lot of value from Impossible Odds. And then you have Jade Winds. Jade Winds is a massive AoE stun for 3 seconds. Costs 50 energy though, so you don't want to use that all the time, but it is very good when you know that the enemy is out of cooldowns or stun breaks to kind of like get the finisher. And then you have Chalice. Chalice heal skill cleanses 5 conditions, which is quite a lot, and will give you Retell for 5 seconds. The Inspiring Reinforcement is a very hard-hitting ability for how much support it gives you. I didn't crit there, but it does like 1000 base damage, and it will pulse stability on you and give a 6-second weakness to any foes that are hit by it. You can also use it as a lightning field, so you can gain swiftness from blasting in it with your staff, so you can like support allies by giving them swiftness, but you generally have permanent swiftness because of the invocation trait Rapid Flow. Then you have Forced Engagement. Very strong skill because it is a 1200 range tether projectile, so it can be blocked by projectile blocks, and it can also be reflected and you can taunt yourself, so you got to be careful there. But it will taunt them for 2 seconds, and during that time you will take less damage from them, but mainly the fact that they're slowed and taunted is the big issue here. It means that you've got them disabled for 2 seconds and they will kind of like walk towards you, so it's easy to land your skills on them when they walk towards you. And it shoots out 3 of them, so it's very strong for like when you're in outnumbered situations. You can use it from like when you're not even facing the target and you're just like kiting, and you just taunt them and they just move slower. You're going to give them weakness as well because you've disabled them. So in general, it's just a very strong aggressive and defensive skill. And then you have Vengeful Hammers, which is also a very aggressive and defensive skill because, first of all, it's unblockable, so you can use this on someone who's blocking and start hitting them. And while you upkeep this skill, you will heal yourself every time it hits. You will deal damage, a decent amount, and you also reduce incoming damage and condition damage by 20%. And these are kind of weird because they actually move counterclockwise. So if I if I rotate around a target clockwise, they actually hit the target faster. So it's not gonna be that big of a deal, but yeah, it will hit faster if you move around the target like this. It's kind of weird because most spell effects like that, they just have a look to them and they don't actually exist in the world. But yeah, Vengeful Hammers do exist out in the world, and they hit when it looks like they hit. So that's a really strong skill to use because it gives you a lot of sustain, and when you're in melee range, it's going to make you a lot tankier and survive people that are on top of you. And then you have Rite of the Great Dwarf. This is a 40 energy cost stun break, and then it gives you a 5-second buff to nearby allies to reduce damage by 50%. It's not really the best skill because it costs so much and it can be interrupted, but it is a stun break if you really need a stun break. And for example, you can give this buff to downstate bodies and make them easier to res. So it does have some applications, but generally, yeah, you want to be using Vengeful Hammers for like the same kind of purpose. Like even if you're stunned, Vengeful Hammers will just heal you, and you don't need to break the stun necessarily. But the F abilities are Heroic Command. You're going to be using this mainly to upkeep your Callous Fervor, and you can also share might to your allies. So when you have 5 Callous Fervor, you'll give out 15 might to nearby allies and yourself. So you use this to set up your burst, and then you have Citadel and Bombardment, which isn't amazing, but if you're like at range and you are in your staff and you can't really get to your Shortbow until the cooldown comes off, you can kind of range cleave from afar, but it's not the best skill. And then one thing that's really important with this is when you have a legendary Shortbow. So the legendary Shortbows will give you ponies or tigers respectively, depending on which one you have. So yeah, it's pretty good. And then you have Orders from Above, which gives retail to nearby allies. Or sorry, it gives alacrity. It's not really amazing, but if you're going to try to swap legends soon anyways, you might as well do that because it will reduce the cooldown of 7-shot, which is kind of like the most important skill. So I know why most of you have come to this point in the video. It's because you want to know how to one-shot your opponent with no interaction. And I'm going to show a few combos of how to do that. So there's 2 ways you can do it. You can either do it through Shiro and go into Chalice halfway, or do the opposite and go from Chalice to Shiro. You're going to be using like 2 sets of energy to land all of those abilities on top of each other. And you'll also always be using Heroic Command beforehand because that'll give you your might stacks. So you're pretty much going to have your Callous Fervor stacked up beforehand, and it's going to basically, you're going to use your phase traversal, which is going to cost 35 energy, and then from there you're going to not have enough energy to land the rest of your stuff, so you're going to have to swap to Chalice halfway. So basically you phase traversal and swap to Chalice, and then you do Scorch Razor into Spirit Crush into 7-shot, and then you can even do a Bloodbane Path right after. You'll also want to have Enchanted Daggers precasted, which will give you an extra bit of damage. So basically you're going to do daggers into F2 into phase traversal into swap into Scorch Razor 423. So let me get some Callous Fervor up, and I will get out of combat. So I do my heal into F2 into port in, swap 4 and then 3, and then you can use your hammers in melee range as well. And that's pretty much the Shiro combo. You can also do it with just Jade Winds if you're in melee range, but you have to be careful that you don't Jade Winds after you swap. Or sorry, you don't swap before you Jade Winds. So Jade Winds will like take all of your Chalice energy if you swap too soon. Like if I do Chalice swap, it's going to take all my Chalice energy. So what you would do is you'd use Jade Winds, then swap, then do all of your Chalice stuff. So it would look like this. So you have, let me get my Callous Fervor up. And okay, so you have Callous Fervor. You're going to use your heal into the F2 into Jade Winds, swap 4, 3, and then go into melee range with the hammers. The next combo is going to start from Chalice, and it's going to rely on using your Spirit Crush early so that you CC them in it. So you're going to be in Chalice, and you're going to start with Forced Engagement, and that will stun them or taunt them and make it easy for you to land your skills on them. So immediately as you taunt them, you're going to use Spirit Crush, and that's going to basically put down like a ticking AoE. And then you're going to swap to Shiro and use Scorch Razor so that you knock them down in the Spirit Crush. And then you're going to use Impossible Odds and then 7-shot. And that will give you a huge burst. So I'll show that off. So you're going to use Forced Engagement, Taunt into your Spirit Crush. Then you're going to immediately use the 5 and swap to Shiro, Impossible Odds into 7-shot and Bloodbane Path. So that's going to look like this. So I get my stuff. And there you go. And that's the combo right there. So yeah, you can pretty much one-shot people if they don't have a stun break into all of your CCs. But yeah, it's a pretty heavy combo. In this first situation, I am assaulted by a thief, which is one of my hardest counters because they can CC me, use the stolen ability, and generally out-sustain you. But I'm a broken build, so we'll see how this dynamic happens. The thief is very easy to counter pressure if I can land my abilities on them. So I use the Spirit Crush on top of myself. I heal as soon as I get stolen into to remove the weakness and poison. And I keep casting Spirit Crush on myself so that I can counter pressure them when they do decide to attack me. And my Shortbow will always trade better. So as long as I'm hitting them, we're doing pretty well. And I get the weakness aura there from my heal skill, so I immediately trade during that moment. And I get a lot of damage just from my 7-shot missing half of its attacks. So I go on the aggressive. I'm spamming my auto attack, trying to bait out cooldowns, but not over investing here. I land my heal once again in Jealous once they steal to me. And at this point, I just want to trade with them as much as I can because I have more health and they're running out of cooldown. So I want to finish the kill. So I swap into Jealous and I just spam my hammers while trying to play as defensively as possible in Staff. And yeah, I just trade so much better because my hammers are so strong. This is a 1v1 versus a warrior. In this matchup, it's very important that I land the Jealous Road because one of the hardest counters to Revenant is getting CC'd. However, Jealous gives you pulsing stability, which is very strong at preventing you from getting CC'd. So it's kind of like this class should counter me, but because of Jealous, it makes me not countered by them. So it's kind of busted. I land the road here and the warrior realizes that and they kite away, but my road comes off cooldown. So I'm able to use that again. I land a nice knockdown, but they stun break and they're playing very aggressively. So I land my road down and I counter pressure. I know that I will win trades if they can't CC me. So I should always play aggressively in my road. I land a nice knockdown into my 3 skill and I Spirit Crush, but I can't stand in it. But I'm just auto attacking and I have so much pressure. The thing is, like, this build cannot be allowed to free cast because it just does so much damage at range. And even though it's like a short bow and not like a range or longbow, it has so much burst potential. But yeah, that's pretty much this build. It looks a lot more complicated than it actually is when you look at those combos. But in reality, you can just spam 7-shot and you can do pretty well as long as you land it. So that's the build. If you like these kind of videos, give it a like and subscribe for more. I'll be doing a Berserker warrior or a scrapper next, so stay tuned for that.